time to dive into our conversation, joined by an esteemed panel. Karim Awad, Group CEO at EFG Holdings, Jacqueline Novogratz, founder and CEO at Acumen, Naguib Sawiris, Executive Chairman of Rascom Investment Holding, Mr. Olushola Lawson, co-CEO at the African Infrastructure Investment Managers, and Her Excellency Sina Lawson, Togolese Minister of Digital Economy and Transformation. And of course, our moderator, Philippe Valahou, CEO at the Private Infrastructure Development Group. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming them to stage.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and very nice to be here. Now, I have the easy job today, which I always look forward to, which is moderating, because I don't have to do the heavy lifting. My colleagues on the left-hand side will be doing the speaking, and I very much look forward to hearing from them. So what we're going to do, I'm going to go in sequential order and ask a question that they may wish to expand on. And I've told my colleagues who are sitting to my left that if they violently disagree or agree with a point being made by one of the speakers, please raise their hand and I'll recognize them, so we can make it look like a semblance of a conversation here as opposed to us lecturing to you for the next 40 minutes. Minister, it's a pleasure to see you here. We're obviously going to start with you. You heard President Adesina talk about the gap in access to electricity, 600 million, which is a figure we keep hearing when we go to conferences. And I think, unfortunately, people have become numb to that number. And represented here amongst the speakers are various solutions to that particular problem. But you, as a minister, you're confronted with well-meaning large institutions, public, sometimes private, that come up with lots of tools that may or may not meet your needs as a government minister. So from your perspective, what is missing or what is working properly?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today. I'd like to put things in perspective. Togo, like the rest of the continent, has a young population. 50% of our population is less than 18. 75% is less than 35. So from our perspective, there is nothing more important than job creation. And so what we need is to think of the infrastructures that are going to be supporting this very objective. And in digital transformation, as the ICT minister, the most important infrastructure from our viewpoint today on the continent is fiber. And why fiber? Because it's really deploying infrastructure for employment. I know that every time when you think about infrastructure on the continent, we think of the mobile infrastructure success story. So everybody always keep thinking about, mobile infrastructure, 4G, why not 5G now? And we believe that we ought to rethink this and say, okay, it's great, but we really need fiber because companies need to have stable broadband in order to establish themselves somewhere. So that's number one. And when we talk about fixed infrastructure, we're talking about large investments to be made. And when we have discussions with, large organizations, not to, mention their names, oftentimes we feel that the projects that they have in mind don't have the scale that we need. You see, most policies that we see today, most financing are addressed too much of a small scale in order to meet our needs. I'm not sure if I'm clear, but there's one example or one image that I always like to mention, which is that imagine you had a swimming pool and you had to empty it. Right now, the feeling I have is that we are emptying the swimming pool with a mug, okay? So it's going to take us how long to get there? I think that what we need to do is understand the infrastructure that we need to build. For example, in the case of digital infrastructure, we're thinking of fiber infrastructure, we're thinking of data centers, because again, we need to support businesses and the economy, and we need to do it at scale, meaning that we need to at some point find, either borrow sufficient amount to just deploy and not start small and then take so much time to get where we need to go. So I would say this is something that is very important to me. I don't know how long I have, so I don't want to be just.
You're probably running out of time.
Yeah. Okay.
We've been put a timer just for my colleagues here.
I just wanted to add
Please,
one thing to that, which is absolutely spot on in terms of the need for connectivity. What we've seen in the digital infra space is the tower companies have succeeded in raising significant capital over the last 10 years. If you look at some of the listed names such as IHS, Helios Towers, if we can replicate that in the data center space as well as the fiber space, that really is the way to go.
Thanks, Ursula. And staying with you, if we shift a little bit to the renewable space, an area that you know well, what's your view there?
It's a good question. Look, we think the most exciting opportunities today on the continent are in the C&I space. And AIM as a firm, today we manage $3 billion. About half our capital is commercial money and half is DFIs. We're certainly a commercial investor. And we've invested probably about $1 billion in equity in renewables over the last 10 years. We've got maybe over 40 projects in South Africa, but also outside of South Africa, where we've helped grow one of the largest C&I platforms, and that's rooftop solar, battery storage, energy efficiency through Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, into Tanzania, and now South Africa. And for us, this is the most exciting space today, the C&I space. If you look at what's happening with governments' balance sheets across the continent, some of the utilities have historically struggled, and that's not being made any easier now. So we're really seeing C&I be exciting, both on the sort of smaller scale side, and then also on the large scale. So if I take the example of South Africa, that's a market which is completely liberalizing the energy sector. So you don't need a generation license to build a plant and contract with a corporate customer. And what we've seen that do is really unleash the capital markets. There's up to 5 gigawatts of capacity currently being bid into the C&I space. And we announced a couple of months ago that we're investing $200 million behind the platform Net Zero Africa. That company is differentiated because it will be both wind and solar for corporate customers, but it will have an energy trading angle integrated as well, so it doesn't need to sell directly to a large customer. We can aggregate customers over time, and I really think that's an important solution. Across the continent, how do we make it easier for people to build and contract privately? And if you see that happening, I do think capital, commercial capital, private capital will come into the renewable energy space.
Can I press you on one point? We've seen in the last couple of years some developers, in particular from North America, exiting the market, indicating that the returns were not commensurate with the risk they're taking. What's your answer? What do you say to them? Because clearly AIM has had quite a lot of success in this space.
I'd say that's incorrect, that we are seeing strong returns. You need to be smart about where you play. I think the old game of just waiting to financial close and then taking a stake, an equity stake, doesn't deliver returns. You've got to be integrated across the value chain. So we think you've got to develop, you've got to manage construction, and then if you've got a piece in the O&M, or if there's an energy trading angle, these are all layers that can help us get to our target returns.
Thanks very much. Jacqueline, that's a nice segue into your own activities in that space. Over 200 megawatts invested, I think, or developed. But I think what I'd like to hear from you is, as we were discussing earlier, some of the market gaps from your perspective, or what's missing.
Thanks, Philippe. And it's great to be here. I'm Jacqueline Novogratz, and I'm the founder and CEO of Acumen. To Philippe's point, over the last we've been investing patient capital, long-term equity and debt in companies that are trying to solve big problems at the nexus of poverty and climate. And for 17 years, I've been investing in off-grid solar. Our 43 companies in the portfolio have reached about 230 million individuals with off-grid solar. And to Minister Lawson's point, I would actually say that we need it all. We need the big, and we need to go into those areas where there's just massive market failure. And when it comes to electrification, we've got a planetary-sized market failure when you're looking at 675 million people, 75% of whom live on the African continent. How will we reach them? And Togo actually stands in a league of its own in terms of a progressive government that has partnered with the private sector to get people onto that baseline. And so the conversation I'd like to have around a just energy transition is how can we be more creative, ambitious, innovative, and realistic about the kind of capital that's needed so that private sector companies can actually deliver in countries like Chad with a 6% electrification rate, Malawi 14%, even Zambia 40%, but in the rural areas an 8% electrification rate. What does it actually take? Because when you do come in and help build an off-grid solar ecosystem with investment, you find very quickly that people move from electrification into the adjacent possible. Solve one problem, and that solution enables you to identify other solutions that people can take for themselves. So what we've seen in Kenya, Rwanda, Nigeria, other countries where off-grid has really taken off is that people might start with electrification, then go to the cell phones for connectivity, very quickly into solar televisions. In Kenya, I first thought that was about consumerism. But in Kenya now, Akili Networks, an education all education channel, reaches about 13 million kids every single day because of solar televisions, solar irrigation, e-mobility. We're really starting to see an ecosystem being built. How then do we take it to those 22 nations across Africa that represent 75% of all people without electricity today? I would argue that, yes, it is about investment, and it's about blended capital, first loss, guarantees, unapologetically philanthropy, so that the private sector can actually set up operations, affordable debt so that they will stay and persist in those countries when the going gets tough. And at this COP where we're looking at losses and damage, there's such an opportunity for us to integrate some of that thinking in a much more transparent and forward-looking approach to bring the youth population into real opportunity, into real jobs. Because what we've seen in the off-grid solar sector, which globally now has reached about 500 million people and created 500,000 jobs, is that those jobs are very aspirational, much more careers, and they then are also releasing a generation of entrepreneurs. And that, for me, is the real way that we do what Dr. Adesimwa was saying, that we take a planetary-sized market failure and turn it to one of the greatest opportunities of our generation.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Can I ask you one point? As you know, subsidies get a bad rap, and yet in Europe, North America, subsidies, rules. What do you say to those critics out there? I mean, it's part of the game. It's going to be there for a while.
Yeah, I always say, as a New Yorker, my whole life depends on subsidies. And I find it deeply disingenuous when we're talking about some of the lowest income communities. So I actually think that what's needed, sure, stupid subsidy, where you end up spraying and praying and hope that people will appreciate the system that makes no sense for them, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But smart subsidy to enable people to get on the energy ladder so that they can actually have a chance to solve their own problems, to me, that's the way that you actually enable choice, agency, and that's dignity. So we're so much smarter than we sometimes assume we are or act. And I think that it's time now when we truly are looking with so much urgency and we have the data on the ground that we can actually do a better job building trusted relationships between the private sector and government and philanthropy to determine the right kind of capital, make sure that we're investing it in the right character in terms of the type of entrepreneurs we're backing, and that then we hold ourselves to account in terms of the returns, not just to the investors, but to the community. And that means we have to get smarter about how we actually measure impact, which also is not rocket science.
Thanks for that. And I think you've triggered something because I think Minister Lawson would like to come in on that point as well.
Yes, especially with regards to smart subsidies, because when we launched off-grid solar in Togo, it was in partnership with a private company, Bbox, and Bbox had a pay-as-you-go model and was able to monitor its market and to know exactly when people would default. And it happened to be in certain regions, it was during the dry period. So we knew exactly who was going to default, when, and how much money they needed in order to not default. So we created what we called solar checks. So, and these checks were provided to the consumer so that it would fill the gap during the dry season. So you can really use data and technology in order to be smart when you do subsidies. That was my point.
I love that point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think as we go down to the next speakers, that point is going to be of interest to them. Karim, you probably want to touch on some of these points that have just been made and technology and its role in advancing financial inclusion. But over to you, Karim, please.
Thank you very much for having me. And I think we're seeing across the continent how the young population is transforming the way financial inclusion is taking place. You see it in companies that do money transfers, lending, and so on. Examples of those are M-Pesa, for example, in Kenya, which is becoming one of the largest companies across the continent, OPay in Nigeria and others. But to give you a bit of an experience from where we are at, which is Egypt, we have as a company a couple of companies that do consumer finance lending as well as microfinance lending. And you can see the amount of people that we have reached over the past 5 or 6 years that these companies have been established in terms of loan provisions, in terms of the projects that these unbanked population that were effectively unable to get loans or financing at proper rates from the traditional financial institutions to finance their projects and to make them employ more people and increase the level of unemployment in Egypt today. And what is interesting to Her Excellency's point is you can see that the amount of delinquencies across the board in these types of microfinance lending has been astonishingly low. And even as the economy suffers or goes through hardships, you will see that the amount of delinquencies there are not even to be mentioned, given the interest rates that you also are able to charge. So in general, we believe that as technology increases and as the infrastructure supports more deployment and payment of loans to a larger part of the population, you will see a larger part of financial inclusion taking place across the continent over the coming few years.
Thank you very much, Karim. And I guess, Robert, that sets you up nicely, since you might want to say a few words on green cloud infrastructure and other things you're up to, but I think that follows.
Sure, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Cloud Sigma, and we're part of an alliance called the Green Cloud Infrastructure Alliance, and which we're announcing here at COP. And really, we see a huge opportunity in Africa for green infrastructure, as we heard from our opening speaker. So what we're looking to do is, so if I zoom out a little bit first, there is an exponential growth of computing requirements around the world, and especially in Africa. And Africa really has the opportunity to adopt a completely new and innovative way of building out that infrastructure, and really avoid some of the mistakes that were made in some of other parts of the world with legacy infrastructure. And that's really a matter of combining the green energy potential that Africa has with new technologies. And so I'll explain this. So the challenge really is that there is a poor correlation between green energy production sites and and consumption of electricity sites. So you can imagine where solar and wind and those kind of projects happen, and you can then imagine where people live, and they tend not to always be the same place. So there's a challenge there. At the same time, there are also large opportunities in regaining energy from industrial processes such as solar flaring, gas flaring, sorry, not solar flaring. We don't want solar flaring. Gas flaring, and actually that can significantly reduce the carbon emissions of that process as well. So by both reclamation and unlocking green energy, we can actually unlock gigawatts of electricity in Africa. And then the other flip side of that is that although some electricity consumption is location specific, such as the lights in this room, a lot of requirements are not. And when we look at computing in particular, a lot of it's non-latency sensitive. That means it can actually be, it's location agnostic. We can, is that better? Yeah. We can bring the computing and the data to the production site. So this actually transforms what you can do, because now we can bring hundreds of megawatts of computing capacity on stream using next generation connectivity networks as well, satellite and terrestrial. And we can then bring that to a global market, but actually based in Africa. And so this is what we're doing in the Green Cloud Initiative, Infrastructure Initiative. So we're actually lighting up projects across Africa that will bring, eventually hundreds of megawatts of computing power to Africa and beyond. And this can actually be a whole set of an infrastructure bed that's based on 100% green renewable energy and reclamation. And this is the way that actually we need to address the demand for computing going forward, because if we don't, we won't meet all these aims that we have in terms of climate mitigation. And so, we're welcoming people to come and join us both on the supply side and also on the demand side of users of computing to come and help us build out this new generation infrastructure.
Thank you, Robert. And before I turn to, last but not least, Mr. Sawiris, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. And I think you're going to provide a bit of a recap of the things you've heard. But given that we have 8 minutes, that will probably leave us with 3 minutes. And I'm just warning each of the speakers that I'll give them 30 to 60 seconds to say, what do you want out of this COP? I've attended the previous COPs, as I'm sure all of you have, with expectations that were or were not met. I think we've all come here with high expectations. Jacqueline, you were talking about the loss and damage discussions ongoing. So be keen to hear from each of you in 1 minute what you want, what you hope. But before we go there, Mr. Sawiris, over to you, please.
You don't have a question for me, huh? I think as someone who's worked extensively in Africa, we tend not to point to the major elements who are impeding the energy expansion into Africa, renewable energy expansion. And the elements are very simple, One is that there should be a system of a guarantee to guarantee payment in case governments do not pay. I mean, I cannot take the example of Togo. If you're a big investor, you're not going to go chase these small consumers because they didn't pay the bill. And actually, when consumers don't pay the bill, it's a smaller problem than when governments don't pay their bills. So that's one of the first problems. The second problem is somehow in Africa we don't want to learn from successful examples in other African countries, you know. So I mentioned the deregulation of the electricity. Most African countries till this date still have the electricity owned by the government, managed by the government, and they have not even thought one time about privatization, not alone deregulation. So if you're a serious investor, you will have to go and deal with these ministries and then you have to go and deal with the distribution problem that if you want to lock to their networks and so on. So unfortunately, Africa is making it much more difficult for themselves to expand. At the same time, they're importing gas and petroleum and paying horrendous prices for the energy, adding to the pollution of the world instead of utilizing their resources by the simplest decisions that they should take, you know. And that's for me has been the biggest problem into trying to provide green energy. You know, at least there is another element, another important point. What people maybe don't know that the mining companies in Africa are on 90% on non-green energy. Means they're getting generators with gas, with all what this brings in pollution, in cost and security, because you have to transport the fuel. While when you have solar panels at the site, and mining companies have the land, you know, they don't need to, and they don't need even to join the grid because they utilize usually 30 megas and large amount of megawatts, and they could actually do it on site without any, but they don't do because again, many other of the elements I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have to pick up on your point on guarantees. It's a point that comes up again and again and again. And I would hope that over the coming days we can have a sensible conversation around that product. There are products that exist out there, and we seem to want to reinvent the wheel every time. I would urge everybody to take that message that there are things that exist out there that have been proven to work. We've got 4 minutes left. That should give us, each of the speakers, less than a minute. Minister, I'm going to start with you. You will have some expectations coming to these meetings. I'd love to hear from you.
Yes, it's really about funding, you know, large-scale projects. You did mention the guarantee, and I think that I was quite hopeful this morning when I heard some of the speeches and the new $30 billion fund that was going to be dedicated to financing green projects. So I think that the infrastructure financing provides us with the opportunity to really combine different sources of funding. For example, in Togo, when we look at large-scale infrastructure investment, we want to come and try to de-risk projects and to work alongside the private sector because we recognize we have a small economy, maybe a perception of risks and that we need to address, and clearly receiving the funds that could enable us to de-risk some of the investment would be, you know, very interesting. So that's a great outcome. It would be a great outcome for us.
Thank you, Minister. Olusala, as a big investor, expectations?
I think interesting solutions to mobilize global private capital into Africa, and in particular, I'm thinking about blended finance structures, you know, first loss type vehicles. Those are the kinds of things that we need to get global capital mobilized to really come into the African climate space. So, interested to see what there is out there.
Thank you. Jacqueline, it's a space you know well. I mean, what would you want? Because, I mean, some have been tried and tested, some work, some don't work.
Well, and we now have 3 different funds/initiatives with First Loss. And I want to make a plug for the Green Climate Fund, which I hope gains more visibility at this COP, because of all the DFIs, they have been very forward-thinking in being willing to provide first loss capital. And as someone who's then had to raise capital, it does crowd in private sector investment. And so to both my colleagues, yes, yes, and yes. I'd really love to see us go more from what we will do to what we have done and are doing and what we've learned from it. with more honest conversations. We also are looking for the right kinds of partners to show the next generation that they're, as a young person recently said to me, we need to see that adults like you, as imperfect as you are trying and building. And so I'd love to see more storytelling with that kind of combination of audacity and humility both.
And I guess if I read between the lines, Jacqueline, you're also talking about partnerships and making it happen rather than everyone viewing this as a net zero sum game. It's about making the pie bigger for everybody, and there's plenty to do.
Yeah, we have so many conversations that are about we need trillions, hundreds of billions, and I don't think any of us disagree. Show us where we are deploying, how we can do more, what does it look like, what have we learned?
Thank you. Karim, please.
I think you have to see that technology has to flow from the north to the south, so protectionist policies that are being undertaken cannot continue because most of the technologies, whether those are for solar, wind, or battery storage, will be probably invented in the north, and I think you have to see them flowing more to the south, which is much need than laying out grid for hundreds of kilometers. You can have more efficient solutions today through technology, and I think you need to see it flow from the north to the south.
Thank you. Robert?
I would echo what some of the things Jacqueline was saying. I think there's a huge potential for off-grid power, and the grid itself can only take us so far. And we have our partners at Earth, Wind and Power who have amazing solutions around this. And what I'd like to see is more sort of practical support and initiatives around extending beyond the grid and leveraging off-grid projects and solutions that can really have a huge potential. And we have all the tools in our hands today. So we can start today. There's really no delay.
Thank you, Robert. And final word for you, Mr. Sawirs.
What I would like to see from a COP, that every time we have a COP, there are recommendations, and then the next COP comes, we have more recommendations, and then we have recommendations. But we never have a session where we say, okay, COP 2020 did so and so, and this was the recommendation. What was done from these recommendations, We should have a big session with all the people who promised and verify what has been promised and what has been done. So we don't feel like we're just into a talking mode.
As you see, Mr. Sawirs, that point resonates very much with the audience. So thank you for that. And thank you.